August 14, 1971, Aquasco Speedway, Maryland. The grandstands are packed so tight that people are standing on the hoods of their own cars just to see the track. The announcer's voice is cutting in and out over the PA because there is too much noise coming off the crowd for the speakers to compete with, and the crowd isn't making that noise because of anything that has happened yet. They are making it because of what is about to happen, because of what comes out of that trailer at the far end of the staging area, because of what a big man with grease-stained hands and absolutely no expression on his face is about to push to the starting line. The motorcycle is named Widowmaker. That is not a nickname. That is the name he gave it. He painted it on the tank himself, in white letters, at home, in the garage of a farmhouse in Hanover, Michigan. The machine weighs 248 pounds. It has two complete Chevrolet Vate engines bolted side by side into a frame that the same big man welded together on a workbench in that same garage. It produces somewhere between 300 and 400 horsepower, depending on which day you ask and how honest the man is feeling. Nobody has ever precisely measured the output because no dynamometer available to a private citizen in rural Michigan in 1971 can handle what this engine does when it runs flat out. His name is E.J. Potter. He is a 29-year-old farm boy from Hanover, Michigan. He has never had a corporate sponsor. He has never had a factory behind him. He has never had an engineering team or a sponsor decal on his helmet or a motorhome in the paddock. He has a torch, a welder, a set of Chevrolet engine catalogs, and a tolerance for danger that the people who know him best describe as something closer to the absence of fear than the management of it. In approximately 45 seconds, he is going to run Widowmaker down that drag strip at somewhere close to 200 miles per hour. And I'm going to tell you what happened to him. Not just today, not just at this race. I mean what happened to him over the arc of a life spent building the most terrifying motorcycle in America out of car parts and sheer stubbornness, and what that life cost him, and why the most painful part of his story is not what happened on the strip, but what happened after he walked away from it. Because here is what nobody tells you about E.J. Potter. The man who built the fastest motorcycle in America was also, in the end, destroyed by it. Not physically. That would have made a simpler story. He was destroyed the way things that are ahead of their time are always destroyed. Slowly, quietly, by a world that celebrated him and then forgot him. By a sport that needed him and then moved on without looking back. By the specific loneliness of being the best in the world at something that the world eventually stopped watching. Stay with me to the end of this, and it is the one that matters most. To understand what E.J. Potter built, you have to understand what the motorcycle world looked like in 1965 when he started building it. The drag racing scene was organized, structured, divided into classes by engine displacement, by fuel type, by the number of cylinders. There were rules about what you could bolt onto a motorcycle frame and call a motorcycle. The rules existed because without them, the events would have been chaos. Because without them, somebody would eventually do exactly what E.J. Potter was thinking about doing, and the governing bodies were not certain the world was ready for that. E.J. Potter did not consult the governing bodies. He grew up on a farm outside Hanover, Michigan, population 400. The kind of town where you learn to fix things because you cannot afford to replace them, where mechanical ability is not a hobby but a survival skill, where the difference between a man who can weld and a man who cannot is measured in working machinery versus broken machinery, and nothing more complicated than that. His father ran the farm. E.J. ran the equipment. By the time he was a teenager, he could rebuild an engine the way other teenagers could change a bicycle tire. It was not impressive to the people around him. It was just what you did. He started racing motorcycles, the way most young men in rural Michigan did in the early 1960s, on machines that were roughly legal for the classes they entered, in events where the difference between winning and losing was usually talent and occasionally luck. He was good at it, not famous, not celebrated. Good. Fast enough to win sometimes, fast enough to know the difference between himself and the men he couldn't quite catch, and smart enough to understand that the gap was not about talent, it was about machinery. The machines he could afford were not the machines that won. In 1965, he started thinking about what would happen if you put a car engine on a motorcycle frame. Not a small car engine, not a compromise. A full Chevrolet small block V8, the engine that American muscle cars were built around, the engine that powered the Corvette, the engine that drag racers were using to run the quarter mile in numbers that motorcycle engines could not match regardless of how well you built them. Everyone he mentioned the idea to said some version of the same thing, that it would not work, that the power-to-weight ratio would make the machine uncontrollable, that no human being could manage that much torque through a two-wheeled chassis without the front wheel coming off the ground and the whole thing going vertical and the rider going with it, that the transmission would not survive, that the frame would not survive, that the tires would not survive, that he would not survive. He listened to all of it. He thought about it carefully. He went home to the garage in Hanover and started welding. The first machine took him the better part of a year to build. He fabricated the frame himself from steel tubing, calculating the geometry in his head and on paper because he did not have access to engineering software and would not have used it if he had. He sourced a Chevrolet small block from a wrecked car, rebuilt it, modified the intake and exhaust to fit within the narrow constraints of a motorcycle silhouette. He solved the transmission problem by designing his own clutch mechanism because nothing commercially available was rated for the torque he was working with. He solved the tire problem by going to the largest motorcycle tires available and accepting that they would wear out faster than he would like. He solved the stability problem, the one everyone told him was unsolvable, by riding it. The first time he ran it, the front wheel came off the ground immediately and stayed there for approximately 2/3 of the quarter mile. He finished the run on one wheel. He walked back to the trailer, looked at the machine for a long time, made 2 changes and ran it again. He was not afraid of it. People who watched him in those early years struggled to articulate exactly what his relationship with the machine was, because it did not look like the relationship most riders had with their motorcycles. Most riders managed the machine. E.J. Potter commanded it. There was a difference in posture, in expression, in the way he sat on it before a run. Other riders looked like they were preparing for something. He looked like he had already decided what was going to happen and was waiting for the clock to catch up with his decision. He named the first machine. He named all of them. The first one was called Michigan Madness. He ran it at tracks across the Midwest through the late 1960s, winning events that had no official class for what he was doing because what he was doing had no official class. The sanctioning bodies did not know what to do with a motorcycle powered by a Chevrolet V8 engine. The rule books had not anticipated him. They created special exhibition categories so he could run without disrupting the regular class structure. Exhibition. It meant he could not win a championship. It meant his times and his records went into a separate column that was not connected to the official standings. It meant that no matter how fast he went, it did not count the way things count in organized motorsport. He ran anyway. He set times that the motorcycle class record holders could not match. He drew crowds that the regular classes could not draw. People came specifically to see the man with the car engine on the motorcycle, and they stayed to watch everything else on the card, which meant E.J. Potter was driving attendance at events where he was not allowed to officially compete. The promoters loved him. The sanctioning bodies tolerated him. The other competitors respected him with the specific respect that serious racing people have for someone who is genuinely faster than they are, regardless of the machine. And then he built Widowmaker, 2 Chevrolet V8 engines, side by side, in a single frame. The combined displacement put the machine so far outside any rational classification that there was no longer any pretense of categorizing it. It was simply the most powerful motorcycle that had ever existed, built by one man in a garage in Hanover, Michigan, with tools that any competent machinist would have recognized, and materials that any auto parts store could source. To understand what it felt like to be near that machine when it started, you have to understand something about the way a Chevrolet Vate sounds. It is a sound that is designed by physics and by displacement and by the specific firing order of 8 cylinders in 2 banks of 4. It is a large, deep, authoritative sound, even in a car with a full body around it, absorbing and redirecting the noise. Now remove the body. Remove everything around the engine except a frame and 2 wheels and the air, and put a second engine next to the first one. The sound that comes out of Widowmaker at idle is not loud in the way that a powerful motorcycle is loud. It is loud in the way that something geological is loud. It is a sound that people feel in their chests before they hear it with their ears. It is a sound that makes you take a step backward without choosing to. E.J. Potter was immune to it. He had built the thing. He had heard it 10,000 times. He climbed on it the way a farmer climbs on a tractor. At Aquasco Speedway in August of 1971, he ran Widowmaker for the first time in front of a crowd of that size, in front of cameras, in front of people who had come specifically because they had heard what was in that trailer. The run itself lasted less than a minute. The quarter-mile elapsed. Time was somewhere in the 8-second range, which put Widowmaker among the fastest vehicles of any type at any drag strip in America at that moment. The speed trap clocked the machine at just under 200 miles per hour. 200 miles per hour. On a vehicle with 2 wheels, no bodywork, no cockpit, no roll cage, no safety net of any kind except a helmet and a leather suit, and the man's own ability to hold on. The crowd at Aquasco Speedway did something that crowds at drag strips rarely do. They stood up, all of them, at the same moment, without coordinating it, without anyone telling them to. They just stood up. He made 2 more runs that day. He was not visibly affected by any of them. He walked the machine back to the trailer after the 3rd run, covered it with a tarp, and started talking to a man about a carburetor issue he had noticed on the 2nd run. Now, I need to stop here for a moment, because I told you at the beginning of this video that E.J. Potter was destroyed by the machine he built. And you might be sitting there right now thinking, wait, this does not look like a story about destruction. This looks like a story about triumph. A farm boy builds the most powerful motorcycle in America, draws the biggest crowd of his life, runs nearly 200 miles per hour on a machine he welded together in his own garage, and walks away talking about a carburetor. Where is the destruction in that? I am going to tell you. And I am going to tell you because the kind of destruction that came for E.J. Potter is the kind that does not make it into the highlight reel. It is the kind that happens quietly over years, while the person it is happening to is busy doing the thing they have always done. It is the kind that is hardest to watch and easiest to miss. Keep going. It starts here. The cameras were there. The magazines covered it. Cycle World ran a feature. Hot Rod magazine ran a feature. The story went across the drag racing world with the particular velocity that genuinely remarkable things travel, faster than manufactured news and more durable than a one-day result. E.J. Potter was, for a period in the early 1970s, the most famous privateer in American motorsport, not in one discipline. Across disciplines, people who had never watched a motorcycle race in their lives knew his name because the idea of what he had built and what he was doing with it had crossed from the sport into the culture. He performed at shows, not just races. Daredevil shows, exhibition events, county fairs, the kind of events where the point is not competition but spectacle. He rode Widowmaker in figure eights. He let people stand 3 feet away while he idled the machine. He talked to everyone who wanted to talk to him. He did not have a publicist. He did not have an agent. He had a trailer and a schedule and a machine that required constant attention and a mechanical mind that never fully shut off. He also had a body that was absorbing punishment. The physical cost of riding a machine with that much power and that much vibration and that much weight through a 2-wheeled chassis over the course of years is not a thing that shows up immediately. It shows up in joints. In the lower back, in the hands that gripped the bars hard enough to manage 200 horsepower delivered through a clutch that was never quite designed for what it was doing. E.J. Potter rode Widowmaker through the early 1970s and the mid-1970s and into the late 1970s, and the machine that he rode was always the most dangerous machine at any event he appeared at, and he was always the calmest person in its vicinity. But here is what was happening at the same time. The world that had celebrated him was changing around him. Drag racing was professionalizing. The big money was moving into categories that were sanctioned, that had championships, that had television contracts. The exhibition category, the place where E.J. Potter had always lived, was becoming less central to the events that mattered. The promoters who had used him to drive attendance were now dealing with a different kind of audience, an audience that had grown up watching televised motorsport, that expected production values and marketing and broadcast commentary and the narrative arc of a championship season. What E.J. Potter offered was a one-time spectacle, a run down a quarter mile that you would remember, but that would not lead to anything you could follow next week. No standings, no season arc. No champion at the end. Just a man and a machine and 200 miles per hour, and then a drive home to Hanover, Michigan. The bookings slowed down through the late 1970s, not all at once, gradually. The way things slow down when the world has moved on to something newer, and the something newer is getting all the attention, and the older thing is still out there, still doing what it always did, still doing it at the same level. But the phone is ringing less. He kept building. He built new machines after Widowmaker. He kept improving the power output. He kept solving the problems the machines presented him with. He never stopped being the most mechanically gifted person in whatever room he was in. He never stopped being capable of running times that stood among the fastest any two-wheeled vehicle had ever recorded on a sanctioned drag strip. He just had fewer places to do it, and fewer people watching when he did. And here is the thing about watching a man like E.J. Potter in the years when the world has stopped watching him. It is not sad in the way you would expect. It is sad in a quieter way, a way that takes longer to feel. The decade that had made him famous was ending. The decade that followed did not have a category for what he was. By the mid-1980s, E.J. Potter was running machines that were, by every technical measure, more sophisticated than anything he had built in the 1970s. More power, better suspension, better tires, better everything that could be measured and compared. He was also running them in front of smaller crowds, at smaller events, for smaller fees. The man who had stood up in front of 50,000 people at a major drag racing event in the early 1970s was now appearing at county fairs and local car shows and small-town exhibitions where the audience had often never heard of him before the day he showed up. He did not complain about it. People who knew him in those years described the same quality in him that they had always described. Calm, direct, focused. He cared about the machines, and he cared about the people who came to see them, and he cared about doing the thing correctly, and he did not spend a lot of time on the things that were not within those three categories. The fading reputation was not within those three categories. He left it alone. But here is what the people who had followed his career from the beginning understood, and what the people who discovered him later sometimes missed. E.J. Potter was not a sideshow. He was an engineer. A genuine, serious, original engineering mind who had solved problems that credentialed engineers told him were not solvable, using materials and tools that were available to anyone. The machines he built were not tricks. They were solutions. Impractical solutions, certainly. Solutions to problems that nobody else had identified as problems, but solutions nevertheless, and elegant ones, built on first principles by a man who understood what he was doing at a level that did not require a degree to reach. The vintage motorcycle community found him eventually. As the 1990s moved into the 2000s, the machines he had built in the 1960s and 1970s began to be recognized as artifacts. Collectors wanted them. Historians wanted to document them. The same machines that had lived in a trailer and been driven to county fairs in the 1980s were now being discussed as significant objects in American motorsport history. E.J. Potter, who had never stopped being the man who built them, found himself being rediscovered by a generation that had not been alive when he was setting records at Aquasco Speedway. He gave interviews. He talked about the machines. He was generous with his knowledge, the way people who have always been confident in what they know tend to be generous, because they are not protecting anything. He demonstrated that the engineering intelligence that had produced Widowmaker in the late 1960s was still fully present in the man who had built it. The mind had not slowed. The clarity had not dimmed. But the body had taken the years that the mind had avoided. Decades of riding machines with that level of vibration and that level of physical demand had worked their way into his joints, into his back, into the hands that had gripped those bars for the better part of 30 years. He died in 2012. He was 70 years old. In Hanover, Michigan, in the county where he had grown up, where he had learned to weld, where he had first put a Chevrolet Vate engine onto a motorcycle frame in a garage and answered every person who told him it was impossible with the simplest possible rebuttal, which was to build the thing and ride it. At the time of his death, several of his machines were preserved. Widowmaker still existed. The machine he had named in white paint in his own garage, the machine that had made 50,000 people stand up at Aquasco Speedway in August of 1971, still existed, still intact, still carrying the name he had given it. His obituaries were respectful. They mentioned the records. They mentioned the crowds. They mentioned the nickname the motorcycle press had given him, the Michigan Madman, which he had always accepted with the patient tolerance of a man who understood that nicknames are for other people's benefit. What the obituaries did not quite capture, because obituaries rarely do, is the specific texture of what he had done. He had built the fastest motorcycle in America from car parts, not once, multiple times, across multiple decades. With no factory, no sponsor, no institutional support of any kind. He had appeared at tracks and shows and exhibitions with a machine so far outside any official category that the people running those events had to invent a new box to put him in, and he had filled that box every single time, and then driven home to Michigan and started thinking about what to change before the next appearance. That is not a sideshow. That is not a stunt. That is a life organized around a clear idea, pursued without compromise, maintained across decades in the face of changing fashions and declining bookings, and the natural physical cost of doing hard physical things for a very long time. He built the fastest motorcycle in America. He rode it in front of crowds who had never seen anything like it and would never see anything like it again. He did it on his own terms, with his own money, in his own garage, in a town of 400 people in rural Michigan. And the world celebrated him for it, and then moved on, and he stayed in Hanover and kept building anyway. There is a version of this story that ends there, with a note of loss, with the sadness of a remarkable man fading from the attention of a world that should have held on to him longer. That version is true. It happened. But there is something else in this story that is also true, and it is the part I want you to carry with you when you close this video. E.J. Potter never needed the world to be watching. When the crowds were 50,000 and the magazines were calling, he was in the garage making changes to the carburetor. When the crowds were 500 and nobody was calling, he was in the garage making changes to the carburetor. The attention was pleasant. The attention was useful because it paid for the next machine. But the attention was never the point. The machine was the point. The problem was the point. The gap between what the machine was doing and what it could be doing was the point. And that gap never closed, which meant he never ran out of reasons to go back to the garage. That is what the motorcycle world remembers when it remembers E.J. Potter. Not the crowds, not the records, though they were real. Not the nickname. What it remembers is that specific quality of a man who is completely at home inside his own obsession, who does not need external validation to keep going, who would have built Widowmaker even if nobody had ever come to watch it run. At Aquasco Speedway in August of 1971, 50,000 people stood up when he crossed the finish line. He walked the machine back to the trailer and started talking about the carburetor. That is who he was. And that is a kind of greatness that has nothing to do with speed, and everything to do with what you are when the cameras are gone.